Transcendental Divine Identity doesn't need to track anything, doesn't track anything. So attention can shift from identification with the spiritual adventure and the understanding of I have transformed and I have changed and I am now this way and I wasn't that way before, to no I at all, simply being present here now without any baggage whatsoever, or seeing baggage for baggage. Seeing baggage for baggage. Yeah. And they're both good. You pick it up, you put it down. But baggage isn't you. It's clothing, it's something, you know, you could say the sense of, you could call, you know, in India, it's the Jiva, the sense of the separate soul. Is not to be demonized, not to be made into some kind of, not to be renounced necessarily, but to be seen through. It's what keeps us on the merry-go-round, in a sense. And it is needing to reassure itself that it exists, because it doesn't ultimately exist. It exists in a relative sense, the same way the sense of worldly ego does. It's not very different, it's just a kind of form. The jiva, or the soul nature, can be engaged in a worldly notion, or you could say notions of success and failure based in the sensibilities of the common society at large. What we learned when we were growing up, or through education, or even television and now computers, is the common, what everybody thinks is cool. You know, what everybody thinks is success. And so having that makes the common ego feel secure and not as though it's meaningless and worthless to be. Gives you a sense of self-esteem. And when either we have, it's funny, it happens through failure or success in that. Either we have huge failure in that, like we're not able to get it. We're not able to maintain a sense of self-esteem. And we say, well, this is not something that I can do. And then we turn to spiritual things. Or we can have great success in that. We get it. We get a lot of it. People say, oh, you're very successful. We feel very successful. And it's still not enough. And then we go, well, this is not it. And then the we that does that, the soul that does that, the ego sense that does that, turns its attention to spiritual. If it's lucky, if it, the most auspicious, it turns its attention to spiritual acquisition, acquires spiritual experiences of expansion, spiritual living. And there's all within that, there's kind of a hierarchy. You know, you can have people who really don't change much, but they buy the right products and they have yoga mats, and instead of doing calisthenics, they now do Tai Chi. And, you know, it's instead of lifting weights, they now do Pilates and yoga. So they don't look, you know, as worldly. They look at this, they're an exercise that's spiritual. And the products in their home look like they're spiritual people, like they have these kind of mats behind me, that kind of thing. Instead of, they have like bowls and Buddha statues and things like that around them, right? And so they have the right art. Maybe they eat the right kind of food now, and they have the right kind of clothing, the right kind of affect, right? Maybe they're not as aggressive as when they were salesmen, and they talk more slowly and kindly. So all of those things, you know, are at a certain level, but then they also might be people who then they meditate, or they might not do any of that, but they meditate. So it's a different level. They don't bother with the outside superficialities, and they meditate. And they do actual forms of yoga that slow the mind down, or open their heart in devotion and refine the experiences, or have more refined experiences, more expanded experiences. And those are different levels of hierarchy in terms of spiritual progress. But it becomes it's still very much ego, because it's like, I went from rags to riches. I went from this to that. I went from being, you know, pretty much an obnoxious personality to being less obnoxious. Still kind of obnoxious sometimes, but less. Yeah, I'm speaking from personal experience here, as Vivian can tell you. So, and this, what I'm speaking of, is something else. Like Transcendental Divine Identity has nothing to do with the personality. Doesn't even have anything to do with expanded or contracted experiences. It certainly can be conducive to be in more and more expanded states. And then you have perhaps an easier place to let go from, an easier place to let go of the sense of an individual I, an easier place to let go of your story. But it can also be more difficult in certain ways, because it's such much more beautiful story. And yet, at the same time, there's a way in which the person who has done none of that, if they hear the teaching and they're not actually clinging tightly, but they let go because they're in suffering, they can immediately just let go of the personality and be shown or see clearly that they are nothing that is arising. They are not reduced to anything that's arising. Or you could say they are everything that's arising. But that everything is not clinging to anything in particular. And so each individual thing is as important or unimportant as every other individual thing. So it's not a matter of like, I'm nothing, therefore you're both nothing and everything. But the way in which you're everything, you aren't anything in particular. And because you're not anything in particular, Zen Buddhists can tell you that Buddha nature is in a piece of shit just as much as it's in Buddha's body. Because Buddha nature is aware of everything equal, everything equally distributed. So you are everything equally distributed. As long as you are like, oh, I am everything, I am, then it's just on the edge, just there. But everything equally distributed also means you're not. Because you're so much, you can't be anything in particular. Anyway, to jump into that, to be that in this moment, any moment, to let go of any sense of the spiritual practitioner, is to let go of your self-referencing, to let go of the spiritual ego. Again, nothing wrong with spiritual ego. You pick it up again. But it's not the same. Like progress is one thing. Being is another thing. There's a strange and true way in which the letting go of any kind of progress or of any kind of future and the letting go of any kind of past or any place that you came from, letting go of those thoughts, the letting go of the notion that they belong to you, that shows you to be inherent freedom in which all thoughts and feelings and present reality is arising in, without any kind of clinging. In that sense, no sense of ownership of anything that's arising, whether it's inside or outside, quote, inside or outside. There's a strange and true way in which, upon attention which isn't ready to simply be nobody, to return to being the person who's the spiritual practitioner, that is a practice. Wow, I was able to let go of the self for 15 seconds. Whoa, I can feel the difference. What a difference this makes. And then it becomes a kind of quote unquote spiritual practice, but it's really not a practice. It's being what you are. And the words of practice or the idea is kind of from the position of the jiva or the ego or the spiritual, separate self. So it's an interesting paradox.